Firstly, welcome to the first Regen Story Cafe. It's so exciting to have you here, and it's so wonderful to see faces that often we're working away behind the scenes and spinning donuts, and we don't always get to see some of the people that we're interacting with. So it means the world to see you here today. And we're going to be sharing some of the amazing stories and voices of people and projects who are putting life at the heart of every decision that's being made across our city and beyond. So that's the purpose of Regen Story Cafe. And we've got some fantastic speakers and stories to introduce you to. But before we do that, I would like to acknowledge that my feet today are placed on the traditional lands of the Gumbaynggirr people. And in this place, it's so vibrant and green today. I want you to think about what country you're on today. Think about a special moment that maybe you've had with it or with on country today. And also to reflect on all the ancestors, perhaps your own ancestors, that have brought you to be here today, as well as sincerely paying gratitude to those ancestors of the traditional people whose lands we find ourselves on today. For it is those people who hold the hopes, the spirit, the story of that place and have done so over countless generations. And here at Regen Sydney, we want to pay respect to all traditional First Nations people with us here today and who have gone before. So we have a really special show for you coming up today. Firstly, we have Joe Taranto from Good for the Hood. We're also joined by Miriam Williams from Macquarie University, whose research flows into cities of care. And we also have Ros Palmer, who will be joining us and dropping in a few minutes a little later today, as she's got some prior commitments. So the format for today is that we've got 3 recorded conversations that from our conversations that happened just 2 days ago with our speakers. We've edited them down into some bite-sized chunks to give you a sense of what they're working on, but we'll also make the longer stories available after this. And the container and the context for our story today is the sticky question of scale. So how might we roll this donut, the Greater Sydney donut, at a different scale? So currently we're looking, those of you who have been with us for a while on this journey will know that we are committed to creating a Greater Sydney donut. So that is a real challenge, right? Because it crosses over 30 different council areas and jurisdictions, and how we do that is going to be challenging. But there's also, that might be a kind of quick and dirty donut is what I'm going to call it. But then there's also amazing stuff happening at the local neighbourhood scale, stuff that we can see and feel and touch, and communities and culture of that place that we know that is really tangible to us. And so one of the questions that we looked at our first in-person gathering was this question of scale and how might we reach across the span of north, south, west and east Sydney to understand what's happening. And so we'll be hearing from Joe and Ros and Miriam who are working across those different scales from the very local to the kind of metropolitan and looking at some of the different themes. And as I was thinking about this, I found this quote that says, it could be that the neighbourhood, not the individual, is the essential unit of social change. And if you're trying to improve lives, maybe you have to think about changing many elements of a single neighbourhood in a systematic and at a steady pace. That's a quote by David Brooks. And there's some amazing work being on the ground with donut economics that's happening, particularly Birmingham is one example, Civic Square in Birmingham. We'll send you a link to that later. But before we hear these stories, I would love, we've got 26 people on the call, I would love a show of hands for who has been at a Regen Sydney event before. If you can put your hand up, wave your hand, or put the hand icon up on your little reactions. Who's been here before? Let's have a look. Keep them up so I can see. So that's over half of us. That's pretty great. Okay, and who's a first timer? Who's joining this network community for the first time? Welcome, Andrea, Will, Michael, Linda, Miriam, thank you. Great, welcome. And Sophia, great to have you here. So thanks again for joining, and especially this new format that we're trying today with the Regen Story Cafe. I want to say that Pete is behind the scenes. Do you want to give everyone a wave, Pete? They can see you. So Pete's going to be behind the scenes and using the chat, and he's been responsible for editing these stories down for us. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Ros Palmer. So Ros is telling the story of the Village Project, and the Village Project is based in Summerhill. It's a really interesting story because it's a story of the sharing economy and how Bindi Lee, who's the founder of the Village Project, who you'll meet at the beginning, had this vision for a physical space and how they needed to create that physical space and create relationship, but then pivot a little bit in COVID. And so you'll hear a story of an idea that is maybe a year or two in, that's happening on a really micro local level that's been expanded out a bit due to the COVID situation. So we're going to have those three scales, as I mentioned: the micro local, the kind of neighborhood scale. And then Joe and Good for the Hood will be talking a little bit bigger about some hoods that are connecting together and how Joe's work is touching a lot of different LGAs across Australia. And then Miriam will be talking to the metropolis and different economies that exist within one single metropolis. So to kick us off, Pete, if you want to hand us over to Ros Palmer.
Welcome to the Village Project. At the heart of a village is its people, sharing their lives, experiences, resources and stories. As individuals facing such enormous crises in the world right now, we can tend to feel a sense of helplessness and despair. Despite our growing concerns about what's happening in the world, we feel unsure exactly of how to make a difference. Our team believes that the only way to move forward is to walk together. The only way to respond to the challenges we face each day is with a collective voice, and the only hope we have is to come together as a unified village. This beautiful warehouse located in Summerhill has been sitting vacant for 16 years and is about to get a $1 million refurbishment by the owner. It will become a green building which will include solar panels, vertical gardens and the use of sustainable and recycled materials. We've been fortunate enough to establish a partnership with the owner of this building, Joe. We shared our vision with Joe and he was on board from the very beginning. Our two teams are working together to bring this building to life and to design it in a way that it creates minimal harm to the environment now and in the future. This building has 3 floors, each with its own unique character. The ground floor will be a large market space that is filled with diverse retailers selling sustainable and ethically made products, and a socially conscious eatery and bar. The middle floor will be an interactive, educational and creative space that hosts a variety of events including workshops, films, art exhibitions and talks. You can also join our shared economy and borrow from one of our libraries on this floor. The top floor will be a space for like-minded business owners and entrepreneurs to work in an environment that is dynamic, purposeful and collaborative. Across these 3 levels, you will know that every single dollar you spend is creating a positive social impact in our village and future sister villages. We want to invite you to reimagine what the village looks like and to discover how together we can create a better world, village by village. The Village Project is being built for our local and global community. We offer you this space to be inspired and empowered, to collaborate and connect and to learn and grow, and to partake in our collective vision that one person, you, are able to make a powerful and lasting difference. Let's make it count.
I'd like to welcome Ros Palmer from the Village Project. Welcome, Ros.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Lovely to have you with us today. I'd love to know a little bit about your work. Tell us about your work and what you do at the Village Project.
Sure. So I am a recent addition to the board. I focus on community and partnerships. So I started as a volunteer with the Village Project, and there are some 40 odd volunteers who do all sorts of work on it. So I just try to support Bindi in finding all of the right partners, in keeping our community close, in keeping our members close, and in invigorating our volunteers to keep working.
Lovely. And what is it that the Village Project does? Can you tell us a bit about the Village Project and what it's doing right now?
So I would say that the Village Project is trying, it sounds, to do something similar to Regen Sydney, which is get that ideology of a circular economy working on the ground. We wanted to make a building where you could, Bindi has referred to it as a social and environmentally sustainable Westfield, where you could walk in and have confidence that you were putting your money where your mouth was, or where your goals were in purchasing only sustainable products, in learning about how to make better decisions in the things that we acquire or consume, as some people like to say. And with COVID, we wanted to translate that idea into something a little bit less physical because we weren't allowed to gather inside the building. So we created a circular economy website. It's share your common good. It's put something on the website that will allow you to meet someone instead of just exchanging money with someone. That will allow us to buy less stuff, so because we're using each other's stuff. And of course, the more members we have, the more we have to share, because if everyone shares two things, if we have 1,000 people, that's 2,000 things that we can all have access to.
Amazing. So it sounds like you're really kind of doing a lot of joined up thinking and you've had to pivot. So you're currently, as I understand it, online. You mainly, due to COVID, you're an online platform that is sharing resources between people. Do you have an example of one of the sharings that has gone really well?
I'm going to borrow from my partner. He just had the most amazing story. We're doing a renovation right now, and we're doing it all out of secondhand things. And he recently went and picked up a bunch of pots and pans for us from a man who's getting rid of all of his stuff because his wife recently died, and he is getting rid of everything, and he's going to take his 3 kids to Thailand, where she is originally from, and they're going to go explore. And he told Miles this long story about all of that just because he felt like that was the person that he should tell this to. So we now have these pots and pans that are definitely not just pots and pans. They're this like relic of a life that this person now feels ready to move on from. So that's a particularly sentimental story, I think, but it's of the type that I hear from most people, where they heard a story from someone or they learned something from someone when they went and picked up whatever item they were picking up.
And it sounds to me like that's something that is really important to you. But I'd love to hear a little bit about like what lights you up about doing this work with the Village Project, particularly, and how it relates.
I think the Village Project is exciting to me because it feels so real. It's happening. There is a building where we are going to do this thing, which gives it the sort of structure and limits that you need when you're talking about the circular economy, because in its very nature, it's cyclical and it's an ecosystem and it's very complex. And so having a place where this thing is going to happen, having Summer Hill, and like you were saying before, to take some neighborhoods and just try to make this happen and make it work, of having everyone in that neighborhood involved and excited about it, of having a network of people that you really feel that it's a face-to-face community. You can really rely on your neighbors. We're creating something that you can touch and feel and name and point to, which is really, really exciting for me.
I love that, like thinking about it with my donut hat on, if you can imagine that. I'm thinking about the local social, local ecological, and how those things are really tied together with the village project and what you're doing there, having a physical space to work in. Now, you've just talked about it being at Summer Hill and being at that local level. I'm thinking about, like, to meet the big challenges of this moment, we need to transform all kinds of systems. How do you see this work as being part of that? And what are your plans with the Village Project beyond Summer Hill? Are there any?
I think that to change the system, people have to see the thousands of alternatives that there are and then be able to grab on to one of those alternatives and to live it. And the more people who do that, the better off we'll be. And for the Village Project, we have had lots of discussion around whether we are capping it at Summer Hill, whether you must be a Summer Hill resident to be a member. I'm not. I'm from the Inner West, but where we landed was that it's very clear that it's a local circular economy, but there are thousands of ways to participate in that, especially now that we have an online platform. And I would say that an original idea of Bindi's was certainly to have sister cities where we set this up. We set up the Village Project in Summer Hill, we get it cranking, someone sets up a Village Project in a different city and just sort of takes the lessons learned. It gets back to that decentralized network that makes things work.
Thanks so much, Roz. I think what I'm really hearing and taking away from this conversation is just the amount of potential that exists, untapped kind of potential within our neighborhoods, within our homes and the resources we have, and within the connections that it's possible to make. That's what I'm really taking away from the Village Project. And we're exploring with Regen Sydney, we're exploring doughnut economics and what that looks like in place at the city and the local scale. And that exploring potential, exploring what good looks like is something that is, super important for us. And really glad to know that, you're out there doing this work, and really looking forward to seeing where it goes from here.
Yeah, likewise. It was so great to talk to you because we're neighbors. We're ideological neighbors. So it's wonderful to connect, and I'm really looking forward to continuing to do that.
Fantastic. So hopefully that's given you, Roz, and the Village Project has given you some kind of inspiration on what is happening and what can happen at a local scale. One of the things that I really love that she said is having a place where this thing is going to happen is really important. And when we're thinking about doughnut economics or economics in general, it can be, it's very intangible, it can be intangible. And what we're trying to do here is bring it down to the tangible level and to highlight that there are hubs. It's not a new thing. There are places and areas that are already catalyzing this kind of regenerative potential. And so what we're doing is not about necessarily creating a new thing or a new hub, but being able to link together these hubs and be able to represent and understand them. Because if we can do that, we can start to see the impact as well as what's possible in terms of the potential to move us towards a regenerative economy, or economies, as you will hear from Miriam really soon. So without further ado, I would like to now introduce Jo Taranto's story. So Jo is from Good for the Hood. It's a social enterprise that you will hear a lot more about in this conversation. So sit back and listen to the next story as we scale up one level from the micro hood to the meso hood is what I'm going to say. And there'll be an opportunity to interact with Jo after this.
I'm passionate about strong communities and connecting people with the environment, and anything that combines those two things really makes me smile. I'm Jo Taranto, and I'm a community advocate and sustainability speaker, and this is my hood. I'm a Sydney mum of 2 boys, and I started a social movement in my community just for them. I'm now co-founder and director of Good for the Hood, which is Australia's first social enterprise which helps people just like me start their own war on waste. and gives them the tools to shape their communities from the bottom up. Now, I've got a science background, so one of my great skills is being able to make quite complex things simple and actually entertaining. One of my other skills is I'm not afraid to be a bit of a human bin chicken. I've gotten a bin more than one occasion, and it's not just because I don't mind getting my hands dirty, but I believe sometimes you've got to be a bit out there when it comes to waste education and engagement. Ultimately, I love connecting with people who have a passion to do something in their area as well. And nothing brings me greater joy than giving people the skills to make positive change in their hood.
Welcome, Jo. It's really great to have you here.
Thanks so much, Alice. Thanks for having me.
So tell us, Jo, a little bit about your work and a little bit about Good for the Hood and what it is.
Yeah, so thanks, Alice. I work as a freelancer. I co-founded Good for the Hood in 2018 on the back of my own community experience of what it is to live in a city. I grew up in the country, and I really had no sense of community when I first moved to Sydney. And so I guess Good for the Hood was part of sense making for me. And there's a real sense that community is, I guess, about sense making for a lot of other people too. Is that who am I in my community, and what can I do that really benefits the people and also the places? So Good for the Hood is a social enterprise consultancy. We have a few things that we do. We provide, like every other consultancy, services to government and business, but we primarily are all about giving people ways that they can tap into their local to make an impact and influence locally, and how they can connect with other people and really start having those very simple but very important conversations about simple things like recycling, about catchment health, about community and loneliness. So it's been a little bit of a journey, but we're in 4 years now, and I think we're just really starting to realize the value of this sort of work.
Fantastic. And do you work, what kind of scale do you tend to work at? Do you work all across Australia, or do you work just within Sydney? Like where's your focus?
Yeah, so we are based in North Ryde in Sydney, and it makes sense for us to work as local as possible when you're dealing with communities. But COVID, like so many people, really opened a whole bunch of doors for us. We have been working around Australia digitally, and I think we will continue to do that. But we really love working as grassroots as possible. My greatest joy comes from working with people one-on-one and really seeing what they can do at sometimes the most micro, but I believe the most sustainable level for change. And so, we work with streets, with neighbourhoods, with local governments, with suburbs, and I guess we have been doing some other work with state governments and things as well. But yeah, my great joy comes from those really local grassroots connections.
Fantastic. And do you have a sense of how many different hoods you've worked with? Do you keep a track of that at all?
I guess when we look at local government areas, we've worked with, I think it's getting close to 150 local government areas, and there's about just over 500 in Australia. So I guess we are starting to make a little bit of a dent and a little bit of an impact, but it is hard to say because, it's a bit like how long is a piece of string?
Wow, and that's pretty impressive, having worked with maybe up to a fifth of the council areas across Australia. I'm curious to know, what do you love about it? What are some of the patterns or the things that you see that really light you up and make you feel like you're on the right path with this?
I really find that the more I do in this world of sustainability, the more it's hard to separate from people, and we shouldn't try to do that anymore. And for many years I worked in healthcare, and health has always been this sense that it's about humans and their systems working well together. And it was when I started moving into this, caring more about the planet, that I was trying to
work out how humans and planetary health really fitted together. And then I realized that they are completely connected. They are entirely the same thing. And I think that was my light bulb moment and my introduction to this topic of regeneration. And I realized that I don't have to kind of make these two worlds fit together. They intrinsically are the same thing, and that human health and planetary health are one and the same thing. So I think for me, I will never try to separate the social from the environmental, because I believe that they should be the connected, and that what's good for the planet should be what's good for people as well.
Hear to that one. And yeah, thinking about those different systems, we've got, you just talked then about the human system and the bodily system and the ecosystem. And I guess to meet these huge challenges that we face in this moment, we need to transform systems at all scales. And so how does your work, both as Jo Taranto, but also as Good for the Hood, fit into that? And which parts does it touch? You've talked about that a little bit, but I'd love to hear more.
I've always believed that if we want to make change, that we really need to mobilise a lot more than just the fringes of our communities, and that we need to make this a very mainstream conversation. That, we can't just be activists, we have to be actionists, and we actually have to move people into doing and not just, agitating. So I think for me, I really believe that, by talking about recycling, by talking about emissions reduction, by talking about soil health and catchment health, and looking at what we can actually do in our lives right now, that my hope is that we can start getting people to understand that these are not just little nice to have behaviours, that these are intrinsically have to be involved in the way we live, work and interact with our communities. And we can't actually do what we've always done. We actually have to live differently if we want to live at all.
Yeah, I love that, activist to actionist and living differently. I'm definitely with you on that. And I know that a lot of people listening today will be feeling that too. Thinking about Regen Sydney now and Good for the Hood, what do you think a picture of success looks like? What does good look like for us?
So for me, good is, I guess, exactly what we're all part of this, is living within our means and meeting the needs of our people. And I think I believe that, there's a lot of benefit for communities in understanding that and recognising how they can get involved as well. A lot of people really want to do good. I'm a big believer that people really want to step into the space that can make a difference, but we need to make it easy for them to be part of that. And for many people, it's never going to be a grand gesture. It's never going to be, changing the world in a really huge way. It's going to be what they can do with their neighbours or on their street or in their community or with their organisations they're already connected to. And so if you can help them see the pathway to how to do that with a bigger, more global view, then I think that for me is good.
That's a beautiful note to as we come to a close. My next question was going to be, what's the biggest message or question that you have that you'd like to share with our audience today? Is there anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would just, don't forget local. I think if you're doing something magical and international and really shaping the world, don't forget that the gift of those connections locally, leaving a little bit of leftover cake on your neighbour's doorstep or dropping a succulent cutting from your garden or leaving a book out for the kid next door. Those gestures are really, I think they're the glue that makes our communities worthwhile living in. And we only need to see what happens when our communities don't have that, or when something big happens and it destabilizes that. To recognize how beautiful those gestures can be. So change the world, do your big stuff, but also remember how beautiful, small, local interactions are also equally as important.
So Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. I want to also say I watched your Planet Shapers TV series last night. I watched the first episode, so congratulations on that too.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's
Thanks,
great
Alice.
to see your TV debut, as it is for me anyway. So,
no, thanks, Alice, and thanks for having me today.
Great. Is there any final words you'd like to share as we wrap up?
Let's go eat some donuts. Let's do this. I'm keen.
I'm down with that. Let's do it. Awesome. Thanks, Jo. Is anyone else feeling like a donut now? That like mid-afternoon snack or early afternoon snack as it is too. Well, if you can just hold off for a little bit longer. Yeah, thanks, Jo. There'll be an opportunity to chat to Jo as well after our next speaker. But one of the things that, other than Jo's infectious energy and enthusiasm for the work that she does, one of the things that really came through for me there is that activist to actionist, and like, how do we actually build these things and bake these donuts as we're going. And it's all very well to kind of banner wave and do that work. Absolutely, it's important in halting the unhealthy systems, but to actually move to actionist is where we're at Regen Sydney, and really thinking about how we do that at our local scale. And I love that answer as well that Ros just put in the chat to Bronwyn's question about how they secured the building for the village project. It was through relationship. Of course, it's through relationship. It's about knowing who's in your hood and being able to connect with them. And those connections are often, accidental connections, I'm sure, as we all know here. So yeah, I love that as well, that quote that we need to mobilize more than just the fringes. It's all very easy as an activist to say what's wrong, and that something that isn't pure regeneration. This isn't that, to say that that's diluting it, but it's all part of it. We really have to see ourselves in this movement as an ecosystem and not setting one thing against the other. I personally feel that is a really important and a really important thing to remember, and it's so easy to forget when our emotions get involved in this as well. So next, on to our last speaker, which is Dr. Miriam Williams. So I'm really looking forward to replaying this conversation with you, because there was so much that I took away from my conversation with Miriam, as you will hear in this, lots of brain explosions and thought bubbles that came out. So yeah, please do put your questions in the chat as we go. We will have a chance for the FAQs coming up in or Q&A in just a couple of minutes. So I'll hand over to Miriam, and then we'll have a chance for some questions. Hi, Miriam. Thanks for being part of this.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet you, Alice.
Miriam, I'd love to hear, can you tell us a little bit about your work and your research interests? Tell us what it is that you do, you're passionate about.
Yeah, great. So I am an urban cultural geographer who for quite a few years now have been thinking about how we create more caring and just cities through a focus on community organisations, commons, and more recently, specifically through food initiatives. So I have a passion for understanding the ways people are responding to injustices and inequalities and attempting to build more caring worlds as a result.
Wow, that sounds bang on for us, and also like a really fascinating and endless research piece to be doing. What are some of the things that you're seeing at the moment? Are you able to let us into some of the things that you're seeing and some of the things that light you up?
Yes, so I, for a very long time, have been fascinated with food. I feel like we share our tables with each other. There are a whole bunch of different ways in which food connects us to people both near and distant, from farmers who grow the crops around the Sydney Basin up to the mid-north coast, connects to soil and microbes and worms and country, and also to those who are involved in the production chains at a distance. So for a long time, I've been interested in the ways in which we might care for those we know and those we don't know through our involvement in various types of food systems, but also how, as we gather around a table, by sharing food and breaking bread, and we share stories and we know more about each other, and these types of encounters we have with other people can be really life-affirming and are a really important part of how I like to spend my time, both cooking and growing and eating food, and thinking about how we can create those life-giving spaces for other people, and how we can improve our food systems to ensure that more people have access to food, and that the food that is provided for people is carefully grown, that tends to soil as well.
I'd love to hear, is there a story that stands out for you in your research? Is there some kind of memorable example, or perhaps a personal connection that you have to one of the, I'm going to say researchees or participants that you can share with us?
Yeah, one of the stories I often think about is the example of the Dish in Hornsby, which is a soup kitchen. And what I find about this story is that it just shows you the scale of the flows of care and generosity that support just one simple initiative. So the Dish in Hornsby was started in 2003 as a mobile soup van, and it is a van that sits in Hornsby Park and serves a 3-course meal to people experiencing homelessness and disadvantage. One of the people I interviewed back in 2019 was talking about how in times of greater need, the more people come along. But what's quite interesting about this example is that it's facilitated by a van. Something as simple as a van filled with trestle tables and cups and plates can enable a space of connection and response to a problem such as food insecurity in a city. And this van is taken out by, at the time I did the research, 18 separate groups who were on a roster. And those groups are each responsible for cooking the food, sourcing the food, and serving the food and cleaning up when it's their turn on the roster. So if you think about one initiative supported by 18 other groups of people who care and who are taking out that van, the webs of connection, the types of initiatives, it's quite substantial. And I think that the example illustrates is the different types of connections people have with each other and the importance of those connections. So there's a lot of these economies of generosity which sustain people. And on one hand, this should be celebrated because people care. On the other hand, we need to think about, well, what are the reasons that the need for this exists, and how do we address those situations that people find themselves in poverty or in need of food relief, because there are broader questions around inequality that Sydney needs to address.
Yeah, absolutely. That inequality, I love what you said there about the economy of generosity and flows of care. And that makes me curious as to, what does a caring economy or a generous economy look like from your vantage point?
A more caring economy is one that would take the well-being of people and animals and planet and country into consideration. And I think that part of that is to recognise the interdependence and the relational connections and our collective interdependence. And I think that some of the clearest ways for me, as someone who thinks about food has always been through food economies. So I can see it through things like food cooperatives or shared, collectively owned food initiatives or food sharing initiatives. I've also seen it in terms of community supported agriculture regimes.
I'm wondering if there's any examples of you mentioned before about these flows of care and how you might measure. Are there ways that you can measure or assess the impact of these kinds of initiatives? Presumably, I'm guessing you're based in a university. It's something that you think about a lot. I'm wondering, as we scale, going from, say, a micro or neighbourhood level and up to the city level, what are some of the things that you might suggest that we think about?
We often get confronted with this question of scaling up, and I think part of the pushback for me has always been it's actually not necessarily about creating bigger organisations, but connecting the ones that already exist. And so I try to do that in a variety of different ways. So from the diverse economies tradition that I come from, part of that tradition is to do what's called inventorying or trying to map out the different types of practices that comprise a particular form of economy. So in my recent paper, I created the diverse economy of community food provisioning and sort of mapped out those different types of transactions and gift giving and enterprises, from food cooperatives to capitalist enterprises. But if we were to expand something like that out across and think about the networks, layers of these different nodes of the different ways that people are doing it. So you could have a food layer, you could have housing cooperatives, you could have street libraries, you could have, all of these different modes of thinking and being and doing regeneration across. You could then connect them up, have some conversations and think about it, because there's also potential and capacity when you connect and link up what's happening on the ground.
Absolutely. That's taking me down a whole little mental rabbit warren now of thinking about what that map could look like and the different layers and that visualization piece, which just feels like such an important piece. And already so much work is being done in that space, but there's always more to do. And I guess I really enjoyed what you said about not just thinking of the economy as one thing. When we talk about a regenerative economy, and changing that to regenerative economies, because there are different types of economies that exist within the city. And that's something that, we absolutely kind of grapple with. So thank you so much for joining us. I know I'm going to be going away and looking at diverse economies and looking at the book that you just mentioned and thinking about flows of care. And so thank you so much. You've given us so much food for thought. Great. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Alice.
Amazing, incredible work that you're doing there, Miriam, and so aligned with the work or the initiatives that we are looking at too. So really excited to have you with us. And the things that stand out for me, I was listening, as I said, in the longer piece to this podcast about with the author of a book called The Hungry City. And I love what she said about that every bite of food that we take is, connects us to the people who grew it, to the ecosystem that grew it, to the people who even made the plates and the cutlery, to the way it was transported. It really links us on every single scale of a system to the biggest system that there is, as well as the smaller scales of microbes in the soil. So really love that. And really excited to hear more about your work as you move forward with that too. So now we've got a chance for some questions. We've got just over 5 minutes, although we know that some people do need to head off probably at 1 o'clock, but at 1:30, but we will be jumping over to Wanda. But let's have a chance for some questions. There were a couple in the chat. If those questions are still present for you, I'd love for you to just turn on your microphone and ask a question. Maybe put your hand up first and I can pick. Otherwise, I'll pick one from the chat.
It was more of a follow-on question just from Roz's reply to Margarita, just around the whole challenge of like capitalist transactions when you're trying to do circular economy stuff. And Roz kind of replied saying, oh, sorry, it's gone. But yeah, I was just kind of wondering where you kind of landed with that challenge. What's the kind of way that you're approaching that?
Thanks, Tyler.
That big tricky one, you know?
Hi, everyone. I'm sorry I came in late. I just want to acknowledge that I'm on Gadigal land, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are here on the call. We haven't solved it. I would say that with resource recovery in particular, the reason we pay taxes is so that council will deal with our rubbish. And now rubbish is transforming in its definition. And I would say that with the circular economy, one thing that councils are struggling with, and so therefore we're struggling with, is that you need a lot of space for the circular economy, right? You need a place to bring the waste, then you need a place to store it, and you need a place for someone to work with it, to upcycle it or do whatever they're going to do with it. Taking the concept of throwing something away and saying, no, we're going to keep it here, we're going to treat it as a resource, we're going to make it useful, requires just tons of physical space. I loved Miriam's story about the van. Like, it's just this one thing that you need, and you can create so much out of that. And I think for the circular economy, particularly, for example, when we take textiles from people, you know, it's just in someone's garage right now because they're a fabulous volunteer and they've been willing to let us store it there for free. But when you talk about storage, you're talking about square footage of expensive real estate. So there's a disconnect there. And I think that right now what we're doing is a pretty standard response, which is just try to get grant monies for that, try to get concessions on rent prices. But the thing that really is just is such a frustrating irony is that when you go for when you try to rent out a space, or you're saying, hey, we'd love to use this unused building for X, usually in a legal agreement it will say you have to be able to prove to us that you can pay commercial rent as sort of a standard. And it's like, well, of course we can't pay commercial rent. We're specifically not making any money. That's the whole enterprise. We're trying not to make any money. We're trying not to be a for-profit. And there are great social enterprises who do that really successfully, but we are not a social enterprise. We're a cooperative. So I would say it's a pretty standard solution right now of grant monies and concessions and trying to cobble it together that way. But I think it's just important to recognize that it's a global disconnect between what we're trying to do and what we're trying to get to and what the reality of legal stuff is right now.
Thanks, Roz. Yeah, thanks for experimenting and being part of that great experiment so that we can learn from your experience as well. I think it's something that we've all going to be struggling with as we try and do stuff differently, and no doubt we already are. So there's one more question that I'd love for us to get through, because I'd love to just have an opportunity for each of the speakers to respond to, which is, how might we bake donuts at our local neighbourhood scale? So Joe, Miriam, Roz, I'd love to hear just a little reflection on, now that we've thought about some hubs and some different initiatives that are happening at different scales. Do you have any advice or thoughts for us as Regen Sydney about how might we bake local local donuts in our own neighbourhood, as well as baking this kind of big par-baked one that we're going to do for the city level, acknowledging that that will have lots of holes in it. So maybe I'll pass to Joe first, and then Miriam, and then Roz. That would be great.
Sure. So we touched on it briefly in the little breakout room we had. And I think for me, it comes back a little bit to the fundamentals of asset-based community development, is that we need to look at what we've got, not what we're lacking. And I think I don't know if we stole that from Tracy or from Bronwyn or Nina, or whether it was just our collective awesomeness. But we immediately said, oh, which bit of the donut are you interested in? And then we all went, why is it that we all go about the problem as opposed to what we actually have and what we can already build on? And it's the first thing we do with Good for the Hood is we look at where we are, what our circles of influence are, and what our capacities are, because why would you go and throw yourself into the worst bit of your community and the hardest bit? We always say start with the low hanging fruit and start and build there, because my goodness, it's hard enough to do that, let alone. So I guess for me, it would be really beautiful if we're mapping things is to map the good, is to look at what's going really well. What are we nailing here? What are we got very strong, flourishing areas of in our community, and then build on those.
Thanks, Jo. Yeah, absolutely. We have this saying in Regen Sydney, which is hunt the good stuff. We're here to hunt the good stuff. So yeah, I think that at a local scale, absolutely. And we'll have an opportunity to do that in our breakouts shortly. Yeah, Miriam, do you have any thoughts on baking local donuts?
I think Jo's really captured a really important point there. But I think, yeah, just look for those unlikely alliances as well, those organisations or those resources that are in the community that are working towards regenerative or caring futures. And they might be unexpected. There might be groups that meet regularly in the local school or local church groups that are fascinated by fair trade. There are people who care and that are trying to address various issues all throughout Sydney and doing really important works. And I've noted, in some of the mapping that I've done, Sydney has over 130 community gardens, for example. And these are community gardens where people are really interested in connecting with each other, but also growing food and connecting over food. And that's just one example of the spatial extensiveness of the groups that exist in local communities. And there are many, many others and many other places to begin.
Brilliant. Thanks, Miriam. And lastly, Roz.
Yeah. Firstly, just shout out to Bronwyn and Tyler about these ideas that are already coming through. And oh my God, the million unused houses that we have. I saw that last night and almost cried. To answer the local donut question, though, I think one thing that we're trying to do a bit better is be able to, as Miriam said, tap into all of the great work that other people are doing and make those unlikely connections. And also to, as Jo said, to recognize your strengths and then to narrow yourself, like to really try to focus on one thing you can do, one thing that you do well, and low-hanging fruit for sure, but then focusing on one of these things in this very complex system, because it's so important, and everyone in this room would know, it's so important to recognize that it is an ecosystem of things that we need to do, that there's not this one linear thing that if we get to that point B, everything will be fixed. It's a network of things that need to happen. And so I think that makes it a bit of a challenge to tease out what it is you're going to work on and to just follow that thread and to do that one single thing that you do really well. So I think we often find ourselves in a place where everything is related, so we're trying to do everything. But one thing that I would love us to work on is to just narrow in and just like follow that line and have confidence and trust that you know that there are other people doing all of the other stuff that needs to happen, because we see them in all of our work everywhere.
Thanks, Roz. What a lovely point to end this wrap on, is that feeling of so many of us, especially if you have an activist tendency to think that nobody else is doing anything, but just know that there are plenty of people doing things. But when you have the energy and the capacity and the will to help, absolutely, there are plenty of initiatives waiting there for your input and your help. So thanks very much, everyone, for joining us. Thanks particularly to Roz, to Miriam, and to Jo for sharing your stories with us today. I'm I'm always so inspired by the work that you do. And as I said, like, I've got a million different rabbit warrens I want to go down in terms of thinking about those diverse economies and how we might map them and what use that and value that will be to the regen movement. I've shared in the chat as well something, a link to Civic Square and what they're doing in Birmingham in the UK. It's a really inspiring example of working on the neighbourhood level. I'm hoping to catch up with Imi Kur when I'm over in the UK in a couple of weeks, so I'll keep you posted on that. But for now, I would also like to just very briefly introduce, since our last in-person gathering, our first and last in-person gathering recently, we've expanded our core team from Pete, Bronwyn, Kieran and myself to include a number of others. So Tyler, who else is here? Some of you have dropped off. Christy, Madeline, if you just want to wave and say hello, or yeah, and Tracy, thanks very much for joining us as part of the core organising team. We couldn't do this without the help of so many people and support of so many people. This is a volunteer-led collective. And so, yeah, as we're looking at different scales and working across different scales, we need lots of support and lots of help. So it's brilliant to have you with us. Thanks very much for that. So thanks for joining today's Regen Story Cafe. The full stories will be available on regen.sydney soon. They're full, about half an hour, about 40 minutes to half an hour, those full conversations. They really are worth watching. They're just fantastic. We'll also share them on Mighty Networks. So also be sure to drop in at regen.sydney and sign up for updates as they come out. For the next 25 minutes or so until 2 o'clock, we're going to move over to a space called Wonder. And that's the opportunity for everyone to get to meet each other, and we'll have a breakout question that we're going to explore together, which looks at the different hubs that exist in your neighbourhood and the different areas that exist in your neighbourhood, and finding some of those hubs so we can think about how we're going to bake our own neighbourhood donuts. So the link for that is just about to be in the chat. My suggestion is that you mute yourself, turn your camera off here, and when you're in Wonder, you just come back and turn it off over here. And know that it's a big experiment, because this is the first time I've facilitated using Wonder. Usually it's Bronwyn that does this, so we'll wish us all well. I'll see you over there in a second.
Thanks, Alice.